The sails flap like whispers in the cold wind. A wide sea stretches before you, its surface broken by longships that do not charge into battle, but instead glide toward a distant harbor. There is no war cry, only quiet voices counting crates, fingers tracing maps, and the clink of silver weighed by calloused hands. Forget the horned helmet myth. Forget the endless raids. The truth is, most Vikings spent more time trading than fighting, and that truth might just surprise you. They weren't just warriors. They were merchants, market builders, and movers of goods across 3 continents. And if you lived back then, if you were lucky, you could barter for silk from China, amber from the Baltics, and silver from Baghdad without ever leaving the edge of Scandinavia. You probably wouldn't survive the journey yourself. Not the storms, nor the frost-bitten nights, nor the bandits hiding along the riverbanks, but someone did. And those someones turned Viking society into one of the most important trade machines of early medieval Europe. So grab your fur cloak, hold tight to your silver coins, and subscribe to the video sharing channel before we set sail, because we're not returning with blood on our swords, but spices in our sacks. Now, open your eyes to a Viking world that breathes commerce instead of chaos. No banners, no battles, just quiet hands exchanging fish for furs, stories for silver, one tide-washed deal at a time. Let's start with what's often overlooked, the world beyond the sword. Even the sagas, those swirling, semi-mythical tales of heroism, couldn't resist the pull of trade. Between tales of revenge and fire-lit duels, there are whispers of merchants stopping in foreign ports, of ships filled not with warriors but with wool, honey, and salted fish. Life in Viking lands wasn't just dangerous, it was practical. And practicality meant you needed things you couldn't grow, hunt, or build. Salt for preserving meat, tin for forging bronze, linen to wrap your dead, spices to flavor stew after a long frozen winter. These needs pulled Vikings toward trade quietly, daily, and far more often than toward war. By the 800s, entire communities had shaped themselves around this idea. Every fjord with enough flat land became a micro-hub, a place where local goods could be gathered and prepared for exchange. The need for trade sparked cooperation between distant clans and rival families. The market square became sacred ground, neutral, alive with voices, and protected more fiercely than any fortress wall. Some of these early markets were little more than muddy patches with wooden stalls. Others, like Koppang in Norway, pulsed with hundreds of visitors at once. Children would sneak under tables to steal nuts, while traders haggled loudly in tongues that sounded like they came from the moon. Dogs barked, fires smoked. Traders sometimes shouted, and occasionally someone drew a knife. But rarely. Trade meant survival. Here's the twist: not every Viking was allowed to trade. Historians still debate whether all freemen had the right to enter markets or if certain families monopolized key ports. Some think merchant guilds may have existed, early versions of today's business cartels. Others argue it was much more informal. Your reputation mattered more than your social class. If people trusted your weight scales and your word, they'd trade with you. If not, you'd find yourself iced out in every sense of the phrase. Oddly enough, one of the more peculiar roles in this network was that of the skald, the poet. Skalds often traveled with trading caravans, spinning songs and tales to attract listeners. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They were advertising. If a skald praised a merchant's honesty, goods, or bravery on the river routes, it was like going viral in the Viking world. One clever verse could mean more business. And more business meant survival when the next winter came knocking. Trade wasn't limited to items either. Knowledge flowed alongside goods. One trader might leave with salt and return with a new way to weave wool, or news of a new god worshipped in a distant city. These interactions reshaped the Vikings, a tribe that had once raided coastal villages slowly started building permanent settlements in those same areas. Dublin, York, and parts of Normandy all bear the fingerprints of traders who stayed. married locals, and built lives beyond their homeland. Still, it wasn't a utopia of fair deals and handshakes. Viking trade routes were dangerous. Ships were lost in storms, goods were stolen by pirates, and betrayal lurked behind every fake smile. But for every failed journey, there were 5 that succeeded, enough to keep the economy alive and the dreams of young traders burning. Here's something strange. One of the most commonly traded Viking goods wasn't gold or weapons. It was soapstone. Yep, a soft, grayish rock that could be carved into cooking pots, oil lamps, or even gaming pieces. Entire villages specialized in it. Not glamorous, but absolutely essential. You'll find soapstone artifacts as far away as Iceland and the Black Sea. Quiet proof of a culture that understood. Value isn't always loud, and that's the real heart of the story. The Vikings knew the sword could take, but the coin could build. The wind shifts again, but this time the scent changes. Not blood, not fire, salt, smoke, fish oil, and something faintly sweet, dried apples maybe, or fermented honey. You're walking toward the heart of a Viking harbor where sails flap like gossip and every boat groans under its cargo. This is no battleground. This is a market coast, and every dock tells a different story. Viking trade wasn't only about what they carried, it was about where they went. While raiders hugged coastlines, traders probed deeper. They didn't just need safe waters, they needed landing places that welcomed or at least tolerated them. And so, harbors became lifelines. Some were natural inlets protected by cliffs or fjords. Others were entirely man-made, shaped, fortified, watched. The busier the port, the better the chances of success and survival. One of the most important of these places was Hedeby, tucked near the modern border between Germany and Denmark. Hedeby was a hive of Viking commerce. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled like fish and mud and old wood. But to a Viking merchant, it was everything. Hedeby linked the North Sea to the Baltic, and from there to the vast rivers of the east and the markets of the west. If you wanted to move goods between Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire, you stopped here. Imagine it. Hundreds of people from dozens of cultures, Danes, Saxons, Slavs, Franks, even Arabs. Bearded sailors yell in Norse. Slavic fur traders unload sacks. A Greek monk clutches a book, nervously watching his crate of icons. Everything moves. Carts rattle, chickens squawk, silver clinks. There's shouting over fish prices and children chasing runaway dogs. It's chaos. And it's business. Still, Hedeby wasn't the only port of power. Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in modern-day Sweden, served as a gateway to the east. It was smaller than Hedeby, but perhaps even more connected spiritually and politically. Christian monks arrived here as missionaries, and Viking traders left with silver dirhams stamped with Arabic calligraphy. Here, markets often blurred the line between faith and finance. And then there were the hidden ports. These were not the grand, bustling harbors with tall fences and customs officials. These were coastal hideaways used by local traders, smugglers, and sometimes pirates. Unlike Hedeby or Birka, these secret spots weren't marked on maps. You had to know them. Some were used only seasonally, when weather or politics made the bigger cities too dangerous. Others were favored by merchants who didn't want to pay taxes or answer questions about their cargo. Historians still debate whether these hidden ports were tolerated by rulers or completely illegal. Evidence is scarce, and much of it comes from old land charters, burial sites, and sunken ships. But one thing is certain: the Viking world was full of backdoor markets and shadow. Docks where silver spoke louder than the law. In one unearthed site along Norway's coast, archaeologists discovered a tiny port settlement with no signs of a military presence, no religious structure, and no farms, only goods, tools, and several imported items. A pure trade hub, lost to history. No name, no saga. Just stone weights, Arab coins, and broken combs. Odd, isn't it? A Viking village without warriors or gods-only commerce. And here's a funny image: a merchant who can't steer a boat. That's right, Some Viking traders weren't skilled sailors. They hired navigators and boatmen for the journey, then handled the deals once ashore. These land Vikings, as some jokingly call them today, could negotiate a treaty in 5 languages but couldn't tie a sailor's knot to save their lives. But make no mistake, in Viking culture, knowing where to dock your boat was just as important as knowing how to swing a sword. The coastal network of harbors, towns, and temporary stalls functioned like veins of an ever-beating heart. Goods flowed through them. So did news, gossip, recipes, and rumors of war. Traders learned quickly where it was safe, where it was hostile, and where it was profitable to smile at an enemy, because sometimes markets stood in the shadow of rival strongholds. In one odd instance from the 9th century, a Viking trading crew landed near a Frankish fortress. Instead of attacking, they offered rare furs and jewelry. The local lord bought everything. A week later, they returned not to raid, but to deliver custom armor for the lord's horses. That's right. Vikings doing bespoke armor orders. You can almost hear the laughter on the return trip, less about swords and glory, more about how heavy the gold was on the way back. What made these ports thrive wasn't just geography. It was people. Shipwrights who could repair a cracked hull overnight. Fishers who sold pickled herring by the barrel. Dockboys who worked for scraps but listened to every whispered deal and every shady transaction. If something big was about to happen, an alliance, a war, or a massive sale, it probably started at the harbor. Oddly, some of the best intelligence gatherers in the Viking world weren't spies or warriors, but dockmasters. These men and women had to know every ship, every face, every name. They kept the peace, tracked inventory, settled disputes. One Danish port record even mentions a woman settling an argument over wool weights with what scholars now believe was a homemade balance scale. The argument ended in laughter and a bet involving 2 pigs. Trade had its own code, its own humor, and its own honor. So the next time you picture Vikings rowing into battle under stormy skies, pause. Picture this instead: a quiet port at dawn, ships tied to wooden stakes, a sleepy merchant drinking hot broth from a carved cup, silver in his pouch, hope in his heart. Not for conquest, but for a good deal. The first thing you notice isn't the gold or the weapons. It's the smell. Salted fish, smoked meat, animal hides still fresh from the hunt, piles of wool, rough under your fingers, and bundles of herbs tied with twine. You step into the Viking marketplace, and it feels alive, like a noisy, messy heart beating in time with the tides. But what exactly did Vikings trade? Most people think of silver, swords, or plundered goods. And yes, those existed. But a surprising amount of Viking trade was oddly domestic, practical, unexciting even. Things like beeswax, flax, and whetstones. They might not win any saga songs, but they kept homes running and ships ready. Fish was one of the biggest staples. Dried cod from Norway could last months and travel far. In fact, it became so common in international trade that some inland European markets began calling it Viking bread. Slightly offensive to the bakers, but undeniably useful. Furs were another hot commodity: soft marten, shaggy bear, even squirrel pelts. High-quality furs from the north were shipped all the way to Byzantium, where nobles wore them as a sign of elite taste. And in return, Vikings might receive embroidered silk robes or carved ivory from African elephants. But not all trade was high-end. One of the most traded items across Viking lands: combs, made of bone or antler, often intricately carved. They were everywhere. Vikings were actually quite proud of grooming. A well-dressed trader with a clean beard and neat hair was more likely to close a good deal. Archaeologists have found combs in nearly every Viking grave, men, women, rich or poor. If your hair was a mess, your silver might stay in your pouch. Oddly enough, some Viking traders also dealt in bird feathers, goose and duck, mostly. These weren't for decoration. They were used in bedding and winter clothing. Lightweight, warm, and surprisingly valuable. A bag of feathers could be traded for iron tools or even livestock. Then there's the more exotic fare. Amber from the Baltic Sea was like Viking gold, glowing, warm to the touch, and easy to shape into jewelry. It was highly sought after in Islamic markets and Byzantine courts. In fact, some amber pieces have been found in desert tombs far from any sea. Imagine explaining that journey to customs. One particularly strange artifact found in a Viking ship burial was a peacock. Not a feather, a whole bird. Historians still debate whether it was alive during the voyage or just extremely well preserved. Either way, it tells us something weirdly important. Vikings didn't just trade for utility, they traded for status. Some objects were valuable because they were rare. Others because they told stories. Take glass beads, for instance. You might think of them as trinkets. But to the Vikings, colored glass beads from the East signaled wealth, reach, and exotic connections. A trader wearing a string of blue and green beads was sending a quiet message. I've seen the world, and I can bring it to you. Historians still debate whether the Vikings produced these beads locally or imported them entirely. Some think small workshops in Scandinavia existed, especially later in the trade era. Others argue most of the beads were brought from as far as India and repurposed into local styles. Either way, you had to have something to trade for those beads. And the list of what Vikings offered keeps growing as archaeologists uncover more. Whalebone, soapstone cookware, reindeer antlers, walrus tusks, seal fat, even fermented milk cheese, though transporting that sounds like a brave man's game. And yes, there was always silver. Coins, ingots, hacked up pieces called hack silver. Silver was currency, adornment, insurance. It jingled in pouches, glittered on arm rings, and sat heavy in buried hoards. But not all silver was equal. A coin from the Abbasid Caliphate, etched in Arabic and polished smooth, was more impressive than local scrap. Many Vikings carried foreign coins purely for prestige, never spending them. Still, not every trade was simple. There's a saga tale, part fact, part drunken exaggeration, about a merchant trying to trade a fine silk tunic for a new pair of boots. The deal fell through because the boots had decorative studs made of bone rather than metal. The silk was real. The boots were warm. But pride got in the way, and the merchant walked home barefoot, swearing never to trust a bootmaker from Hadebe again. Little things mattered. Even measurements varied. Without standardized scales, traders often used weights carved from lead, bronze, or even stone. But of course, not every weight was honest. A clever merchant might file his scale just enough to tip the deal. It wasn't illegal, at least not in the eyes of Odin. Just smart business. Here's a bit of an odd twist. Viking traders also engaged in gift exchange as a form of diplomacy. This wasn't true trade, no haggling, no payment, but the gifting of exotic items to build alliances. A sword from Francia here, a fur cloak there. Sometimes these gifts were meant to impress. Other times, they were meant to intimidate. Look what I can afford to give away, the gift said. Imagine what I kept. Some scholars think these gift exchanges formed the foundation of Viking Age diplomacy. Not just with kings and earls, but between village leaders, ship captains, even religious figures. It blurred the line between economy and ritual. And then there's this curious fact. Some Viking traders believed in blessing their goods. Runic inscriptions have been found on traded items' bones, tools, even beads that read things like luck to the buyer, or may this bring gold. Whether it was clever marketing or genuine belief, it turned each trade into something personal. Almost magical. So the next time you picture a Viking trader, imagine someone sharp-eyed and quick-witted. Someone who knew the worth of things, not just in silver, but in story. Because behind every bundle of furs or string of beads was a tale, a journey across dangerous waters, a tense bargain struck over a fire, or a lucky find in a faraway market. And, in the end, what the Vikings truly traded was connection. The rivers wide and cold curling like a silver thread through forests that feel older than memory. You're on a longship now, not a warship, but a merchant's vessel, low and sturdy, with broad sails and cargo lashed beneath rough tarps. The oars creak, the men grunt, and the shore slips by like a dream. This is no raid. This is the Northern Silk Road. Long before Marco Polo wrote his stories, Viking traders were making their way east, not by horse, but by water. From the fjords of Norway and Sweden, they followed vast river systems deep into the European continent, through what is now Russia, Ukraine, and even as far as the Caspian and Black Seas. These weren't one-time expeditions. They were well-worn routes, mapped not with ink, but with scars, songs, and shared stories. At the heart of these routes was the great city of Novgorod. Though it grew larger after the Viking Age, its early version, Holmgard, was a key station for Norse traders. From there, rivers like the Volkhov, Dnieper, and Don carried them further inland to trading centers like Kiev and eventually Constantinople. Yes, Constantinople, the city the Vikings called Miklagard, the Great City, a place of towering walls, gold mosaics, and more wealth than any Norse village could imagine. It was the dream, the jackpot, the fabled market at the end of the world. But getting there? A test of everything. The river routes weren't gentle. Waterfalls had to be bypassed by dragging ships overland on logs, a grueling process called portaging. Imagine hauling tons of timber, cloth, and silver over muddy forest trails, all while swatting away flies and watching for thieves in the trees. Vikings called these the carrying places, and some were so treacherous they were said to be cursed. Superstitious traders would toss coins into the water before crossing bribes for the river spirits, just in case. Historians still debate whether Vikings mapped these routes formally or passed knowledge down orally. Some argue that carved wooden charts existed. None have survived, but most believe the routes were memorized by seasoned navigators and apprentices alike. It wasn't just the path they memorized, but also which villages were friendly, which required bribes, and which were better avoided at night. And here's something strange. Many Viking traders didn't go all the way themselves. Instead, they formed relay-style networks. One group would travel from Burka to Novgorod. Another would take the goods from Novgorod to Kiev. A third group might continue to the Black Sea. This wasn't inefficiency, it was strategy. Each crew knew their stretch of river, their dangers, their dialects. Together, they formed a human supply chain that moved silk, silver, spices, and stories across half the known world. And what came back up those rivers? Durham's silver coins from the Islamic world by the thousands. In fact, more Abbasid silver coins have been found in Viking Age Scandinavia than in most of the Middle East. One hoard discovered in Gotland held over 67,000 dirhams, a treasure of staggering scale and a clue to the intensity of Viking Eastern trade. Oddly, many of these coins were chopped up, literally cut into bits. Viking traders didn't always care about the coin's origin or its artistic beauty. They valued weight. A half dirham might pay for a fine cloak. A full one could buy a cow or a boat ride. The coins jingled in leather pouches, were sewn into tunics, or melted down into jewelry, and sometimes buried in fear of thieves, never to be found again until a lucky farmer's shovel struck silver centuries later. But the East offered more than money. Silk, of course, soft, shimmering, impossibly rare. Vikings didn't make silk. They couldn't. It came from China, passed through Persian and Byzantine hands before reaching Norse fingers. A Viking wearing silk wasn't just showing off, they were making a statement. I've traveled. I've traded. I've seen what lies beyond the forests. Then there were spices, cinnamon, pepper, cardamom, aromas utterly foreign to northern noses. There's no evidence Vikings used them in large quantities, but the elite surely tasted them at least once. Maybe on feast days, maybe just to boast. And weapons too. Not Viking swords, but curved Eastern blades, bronze inlaid shields, and sometimes even armor made in Baghdad. These weren't tools of war, they were trophies of trade, but the most curious exchange: people. Some Viking merchants weren't just moving goods, they were moving themselves, settling, intermarrying, forming hybrid communities. Evidence shows that in places like Kiev, Norse and Slavic cultures merged deeply. Viking names appear in Russian chronicles. Norse burial customs blend with Slavic ones. And in Constantinople, Norsemen formed the Varangian Guard, elite bodyguards to the emperor himself. These weren't mercenaries by chance. Many had arrived as traders, learned the roads, earned the trust, and were then hired for protection. Imagine a Viking guarding a golden gate rather than storming it. There's a story half legend, half truth about a Norse merchant arriving in Baghdad with a gift of polar bear skins. The caliph, amused and perhaps slightly terrified, rewarded him not with gold, but with a robe embroidered with golden thread. The merchant returned to Sweden a legend. His children wore that robe at feasts for generations, but not every journey ended with riches. Some longships were lost to sudden storms. Others were taken by bandits on the riverbanks. One discovered wreck held nothing but burned bones and shattered combs. An entire trade expedition wiped out. No one knows their names, but the market felt their loss. Even so, the risk was worth it, because to a Viking trader, the East wasn't just a direction, it was opportunity. It was gold in the mud, silk in the snow, cinnamon in the fire, and as the longship glides forward under starlight, sails whispering like prayers, you can almost believe it. There's a warmth rising from the fire pit, and the smell of roasted meat mixes with the sound of voices, a low, steady hum. You've stepped into a Viking market day, not in a port city this time, but in a forest clearing that appears just once a month. No signs, no walls, just a rhythm. Tents rise like mushrooms overnight, and by morning, a town is born. This is more than just buying and selling. It's an event, a celebration, a performance. Viking markets weren't permanent, especially in the inland regions. They were seasonal, often held during festivals, religious gatherings, or after harvests when goods were plenty. Traders would travel for days, sometimes weeks, on foot or by river, guided not by maps, but by the calendar, the moon, and word of mouth. The location might be a sacred grove, a hill near a crossroads, or even a burial mound. These weren't chosen at random. They held symbolic meaning. Some scholars suggest that certain markets were deliberately held at ancient religious sites to give the transaction spiritual weight, a good deal blessed by the gods. What you see at these markets is pure sensory overload: meat sizzling on iron grills, skins stretched across frames, wooden barrels brimming with mead, sheep bleating, horses whinnying, flutes and lyres playing in the background. Everything smells like pine needles, smoke, wet fur, and honey. There's shouting, laughter, flirting, deals struck with a handshake or a slap on the back. It's messy, noisy, and utterly alive. Bartering is the name of the game. No set prices, no currency tables. Just your goods, your silver, your charm. If you're lucky or particularly clever, you might walk away with a better deal than you expected. But it's not always so friendly. A well-known practice among Viking traders was to inflate stories about their wares. A bolt of dyed wool might be presented as Frankish weave. Salted fish might be described as blessed by a seer. Everyone knew the game, of course, and part of the haggling dance involved pretending to believe each other's wildest claims before calmly cutting the price in half. In one famous account from a saga, a trader tried to pass off a goat as a forest deer raised by monks. It almost worked until the goat sneezed and knocked over a nearby jar of honey, starting a minor riot that ended in 3 broken ribs and 1 free goat. But not all trade was physical. Some came to buy ideas. These market days were often the only time isolated farmers or distant villagers could meet outsiders. A trader from Denmark might share news from Frankish lands. A Slavic merchant might carry songs from the Black Sea. Stories, jokes, and even proverbs were passed along like currency. A good tale could win you a drink. A new riddle might get you an extra candle or a warm meal. Historians still debate whether Viking markets had official oversight. Some sagas suggest local chieftains or religious leaders kept the peace. Others hint that merchants themselves created codes of conduct, unwritten rules that, if broken, could get you banned or worse. Interestingly, some markets even had market judges. These weren't full-time lawmen. They were respected elders, traders, or even scalds poets called upon to settle disputes. If you were caught cheating a customer or lying about your goods, you'd be marched to the center and made to explain yourself. The punishment? Sometimes a fine, sometimes public embarrassment. And in one rare case, according to folklore, man was forced to wear a pig mask for an entire day while selling his wares. Market justice could be harsh, but it was fast. And importantly, it kept trade flowing. Here's an odd custom: market bonding. Some Viking regions practiced symbolic partnerships between traders. If you entered into a trade bond, you'd share profits and losses, and even represent each other in other markets. These bonds were often sealed with a shared drink, a carved token split in half, or occasionally a joke so specific and humiliating that only the two of you would understand it. There's one recorded instance where two bonded traders would pretend to be brothers-in-law in every town they visited, complete with fake arguments, dramatic reconciliations, and one performance involving a stolen duck. Why? Because it drew crowds. And crowds meant sales. Market days also had spiritual elements. A trader might carry a carved Thor's hammer or a small idol of Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity. Some made small sacrifices at temporary altars: a splash of mead, a sliver of dried meat, even a lock of hair. Not for superstition, they'd claim, but just in case. And what did people not trade? There were rules, usually unspoken, sometimes enforced. Children weren't for sale, nor sacred objects stolen from burial grounds. And while weapons were available, it was considered bad luck to sell a sword without a story. A nameless blade could bring misfortune. A sword with a tail? That could fetch a fortune. One strange item that shows up again and again in archaeological digs: gaming pieces. Small, rounded stones or bone-carved tokens used for strategy games. Some were simple. Others, elaborately decorated with faces or symbols. These weren't just toys, they were trade goods. A sign of leisure, intelligence, and culture. In fact, gifting a gaming piece to a host was a subtle way of saying, "I am more than a merchant. I am worth your respect." By sunset, the market begins to dissolve. Tents collapse. Fires die down. Carts creak under the weight of leftover goods and new treasures. Traders shake hands or hug or curse under their breath. Some return home richer, some poorer. But everyone leaves with something: a story, a laugh, a bruise, or a quiet pride in surviving the chaos once again. And when the wind picks up and the clearing returns to silence, it's as if it was never there at all, but it was. For a day, a week, maybe more. A pulse in the Viking world. A place where warriors became traders, strangers became friends, and a simple comb could be worth more than a sword. The road narrows, winding past smoky farms and stony fields until it opens into something unexpected. You see not just a village, but a miniature city. Wooden buildings, packed docks, wide streets worn smooth by carts. Market stalls overflow. Boats unload silks, coins glint in the hands of children. Welcome to Burka, or maybe Hidibi. Either way, you've just stepped into the pulsing core of Viking commerce. Unlike the pop-up markets of the countryside, these weren't temporary. They were purpose-built trading towns, permanent, protected, and powerful. Let's start with Hedeby. By the early 9th century, it was the largest Viking trade town in Scandinavia, tucked near the base of the Jutland Peninsula. Its location was everything. Sitting between the North Sea and the Baltic, it offered a shortcut between the Atlantic world and the rivers of the East. Traders could dock, exchange cargo, and skipped the long, dangerous sail around Denmark. Hedeby was fortified with ramparts and ditches, its docks thick with masts, its streets lined with houses that doubled as shops and storage rooms. Archaeologists have found entire workshops where jewelers crafted silver rings, glassblowers shaped beads, and smiths hammered out iron tools. One building held hundreds of whalebone gaming pieces, suggesting not only trade but thriving leisure. And yet, it wasn't pretty. The town stank of smoke, fish, tar, and animal fat. The streets were muddy. Fires burned day and night. Sewage flowed in shallow trenches. But to a Viking merchant, it was beautiful. It meant business. It meant opportunity. Then there's Burka, shimmering like a dream in the middle of Lake Mälaren in what's now Sweden. Smaller than Hedeby, but more mystical, less dockyards and more temples. It became a crossroads not just for goods, but for ideas. One of the first Christian missions to Scandinavia arrived here. An archbishop named Ansgar came bearing crosses and books in the 9th century. He didn't exactly convert the town, but he did leave behind monks, churches, and curious minds. Some Viking traders left Burka with Bibles tucked beside their silver coins. Historians still debate whether Burka was primarily commercial or quasi-religious. Some see it as a holy experiment gone halfway. Others believe its success came from blending both trade and faith. One thing is clear: Christian goods, cross pendants, liturgical cloth, even relics were traded alongside pagan idols, creating an almost absurd spiritual marketplace. Here's something odd. In the graves of Burka's elite traders, archaeologists have found goods from Byzantium, the Islamic world, and even Central Asia. Silk robes wrapped around Norse bones, Frankish. Weapons placed beside Arabic coins. It's like someone tried to bury the entire known world in a single coffin. Why so lavish? Partly pride, partly belief, but mostly branding. In these towns, your reputation as a merchant mattered. It wasn't just what you sold, but how you lived, how you dressed, how you died. A burial filled with foreign goods told the world, this man saw beyond the fjords. He touched distant lands. That mattered. In one particularly strange Burka grave, a woman was buried with silver scales and the remains of a peacock feather fan. Not a queen, a merchant, or more likely, a merchant's widow. Scholars suspect she ran her late husband's trading house, carried on the business, and commanded such respect that she was buried as though she were royalty. And yet, not everything glittered. Both towns were vulnerable. Hedeby was burned to the ground in the mid-11th century, possibly by rival Vikings. Its ruins still lie near the modern German-Danish border. Burka simply faded. Some think its lake route became less profitable. Others blame shifting alliances, new trade hubs, or disease. Its decline wasn't violent, just quiet. But while they lasted, they were beacons, lighthouses for the Viking merchant. And they were weirdly cosmopolitan. In Hedeby, inscriptions and runes sit beside graffiti in Latin and Arabic. Bones found in graves show people from as far as Central Asia lived and died there. Children with mixed heritage played in the streets. Traders switched between tongues like clothes, Norse in the morning, Frankish by lunch. Maybe a few Slavic curses over dinner. One Hedeby merchant was even known to carry 2 sets of scales, one for domestic weights, one for foreign measures. Whether this was convenience or trickery, well, that's still up for debate. Even law took on a new tone in these towns. Unlike the law things of rural communities, where disputes were settled by local chieftains or family votes, towns like Hedeby had more formal systems. Some records suggest fines for cheating, rules for dock use, and even agreements about sanitation. One amusing scrap of evidence points to a merchant being fined for dumping fish guts too close to the cheese stall. A Viking health code in its infancy. And don't forget the boats. Hedeby housed skilled shipwrights who built not only warships, but merchant vessels. These were wider, deeper, slower, but able to carry cargo more safely across long distances. Some had hidden compartments, possibly for silver or slaves. Others were designed to hug coastlines, with flat bottoms for shallow rivers and quick landings. These ships weren't just tools, they were brands. A beautifully carved prow could signal status. A unique sail pattern might identify a merchant's origin before they even docked. One saga tells of a trader who always used red sails embroidered with gold thread. Not for stealth, but so people knew he had arrived. Markets in Burka and Hidibi also doubled as safe havens. If a storm caught your ship, if a rival clan declared a feud, if your village was lost to fire, these towns offered shelter. Their walls protected not just wealth, but peace. Within them, you could strike deals with enemies, laugh over mead with competitors, or hide from your past. So what were Burka and Hidibi really? Not just trade towns, not just ports. They were Viking dreams, carved in wood and stone. Places where ambition found anchor, where silver turned into silk, where whispers from Byzantium became lullabies in Norse cradles, and when the wind carried their names downriver, young traders whispered, "Someday, I'll go there." But Viking trade didn't end at the walls of Hidibi or the docks of Burka. No, those towns were only waypoints in a much larger journey. To understand the full scope of Viking commerce, you have to follow the rivers, not the fjords, not the sea. The rivers of the east, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don. By the early 9th century, Norse traders were no longer just hugging coastlines. They were inland voyagers, paddling deep into the vast forested heart of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They followed the rivers south past Slavic villages, through dangerous rapids, toward lands no Viking saga had yet dared to describe. And they weren't raiding, they were dealing. These Norsemen had a name, the Varangians, and they weren't just merchants. They were culture crossers, polyglot middlemen who spoke Old Norse, Slavic, Greek, and even Arabic. They wore cloaks of Baltic wool, belts of Frankish leather, and boots copied from Khazar horsemen. They carried scales in one pouch and axes in the other. But what were they chasing? Silver. Silver was the lifeblood of Viking trade. It flowed like water through their hands. In the West, they took it by force, raiding monasteries, looting English towns. But in the East, they earned it through trade, alliances, and diplomacy. And the richest veins of silver lay far beyond the horizon. In the Islamic caliphates, specifically in the hands of the Abbasids, whose economy was built on the dirham, a silver coin minted in cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Nishapur. So how did a Viking get from a cold Scandinavian harbor to the heart of the Muslim world? Through the rivers. The Volga route took them from the Baltic Sea, across Lake Ladoga, down through Novgorod, and onto the Volga River. They would pass through wild forests, fortified Slavic towns, and vast steppelands. Eventually, they reached the Caspian Sea, where they could trade directly with Persian and Arab merchants. And what did they bring? Fur, mostly. Furs from Arctic foxes, martens, beavers. Slaves, too, captured from Baltic and Slavic tribes, amber. Swords, walrus ivory, and in return, silver. Lots of it. Some Viking graves in Sweden contain thousands of Islamic dirhams, more than were found in some actual Muslim cities. This silver didn't just pile up. It circulated. It got chopped into pieces, melted down, turned into jewelry, or reused for trade. To the Vikings, silver wasn't just money, it was weight. A measure of value, not denomination. A necklace could be currency. So could a bracelet. Or a hacked-off chunk of coin. One Viking hoard in Gotland contains over 67 kilograms of silver. That's more than 140 pounds, nearly a full-grown man made of metal. But silver wasn't all they brought back. They returned with ideas. Islamic geometry influenced Viking art. Arabic numerals appeared in runes. Even their boats changed, becoming more versatile for river travel. In some sagas, the names of eastern cities like Sörkland, meaning land of the Saracens, appear alongside Asgard and Midgard. Myth and geography began to blend. There's one particular document that shines a strange light on all this. the writings of Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He was a 10th century emissary from Baghdad who met the Rus Viking traders in what is now Russia. He described them as tall, blond, heavily tattooed, and both terrifying and fascinating. They had strange rituals, strange manners. He admired their craftsmanship, but was horrified by their hygiene. He famously wrote, "They are the filthiest of God's creatures. They do not clean themselves after defecating, nor do they wash after intercourse. They are like wild donkeys." Still, Ibn Fadlan couldn't deny their strength or their success. He watched them perform a brutal ship burial for a dead chieftain complete with human sacrifice and marveled at their stoicism. Despite the judgment, he knew these were not mere barbarians. They were players in a global game, and at the center of that game, the city of Kiev. Yes, that Kiev. By the 10th century, it had become a hub for the Varangians, a key point on the Dnieper River trade route to Constantinople. Here, Viking merchants partnered with Slavic leaders, forming a new ruling class known as the Rus. They were Norse in origin but Slavic in style. Over time, they would give rise to the Kievan Rus, the first real Russian state. So imagine it, a Viking merchant in Kiev, writing letters in Cyrillic, counting in Arabic, haggling with Byzantine diplomats, and ending the day by drinking fermented Mare's milk on a Slavic porch. Globalization, before the word existed. And then, Constantinople, the greatest prize of them all. The Vikings called it Miklagard, the great city. It dazzled them. Walls higher than anything they'd seen. Streets paved with stone. Markets overflowing with gold, silk, and spices. They couldn't conquer it, but they didn't have to. Trade agreements allowed selected Viking merchants to enter, do business, and leave rich beyond belief. Some never left. Many Norsemen joined the Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. These weren't just mercenaries. They were symbols. Fierce, loyal, exotic. The very presence of these axe-wielding northerners in Constantinople's marble halls was proof Viking trade had reached its pinnacle. And so, from a windswept fjord to a golden dome, the Viking merchant carved a path through the known world. A path lit not by torches, but by opportunity. Not just raiders, not just warriors, traders, diplomats, navigators of both sea and soul. And that legacy? It's not buried in sagas. It's buried in the ground, in the silver hoards of Sweden, the runic graffiti on Hagia Sophia's walls, the Slavic words hidden in Norse tongues. It's the story of how a people shaped by cold winds and isolation reached across continents, not just to take, but to connect. By the turn of the 11th century, the image of the Viking was changing, not only in the eyes of their neighbors, but also within their own sagas. The era of open raids was waning. Europe was fortifying, Christianizing, uniting. Castles replaced monasteries as the targets of opportunity. Armies grew smarter. Kings grew stronger. But Viking ambition hadn't faded. It had simply evolved. And nowhere was this evolution clearer than in the world of Viking diplomacy and political power. Let's return west now to the coasts of Normandy, where a Scandinavian warlord named Rollo made an unusual decision. In 911, after decades of raiding France's northern shores, Rollo struck a deal with the Frankish king, Charles the Simple. In exchange for land and legitimacy, Rollo agreed to become a Christian and defend the realm against other raiders. Thus Normandy, land of the Northmen, was born. This wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Rollo's descendants didn't fade into history. They shaped it. His great-great-great-grandson would be William the Conqueror, the man who crossed the English Channel in 1066 and changed the course of European history forever, from raiders to rulers. But what does this have to do with Viking trade? Everything, because behind every throne built by Viking hands was a network of commerce, a supply chain of wealth, weaponry, and prestige. The Normans built fortresses and feudal systems, but they never forgot the Norse gift of adaptability. Trade wasn't just about goods. It was about influence. And the most influential of all Viking trade hubs. Dublin. Founded around 841 AD, Dublin began as a longfort, a fortified Viking ship harbor. But it quickly grew into a bustling town, a center of power for the Norse Gaels, Vikings who had intermarried and integrated with the Irish. Here, trade was king. Viking Dublin exported slaves, furs, hides, and crafted goods across the Irish Sea and beyond. Its harbor bustled with activity. In fact, Dublin would go on to become one of the largest slave markets in all of Western Europe. Slavery, a harsh truth at the heart of Viking commerce. Vikings captured and sold people by the thousands: Slavs, Celts, Anglo-Saxons. In fact, the very word slave comes from Slav, due to the sheer number of Slavic people trafficked during this era. It was brutal, but it was also profitable and deeply entwined with the success of Viking cities. Slaves were currency, especially in trade with the Islamic world, where labor shortages fueled demand. But not all Viking trade was dark. From their towns, they exported crafted goods of exquisite beauty, finely woven textiles, carved combs, iron tools, and ornaments of amber and jet. They imported wine, glassware, spices, and silks. And these weren't luxury goods for the elite. They filtered down into the lives of everyday Norse people. One archaeological site in central Sweden revealed glassware from Italy and spices from the Levant used not by a noble, but by a humble farmer's family. The Viking world was becoming cosmopolitan. And this new cosmopolitanism brought about another great change: Christianity. By the 11th century, much of Scandinavia had converted. Not by fire and sword, but by trade, diplomacy, and slow cultural osmosis. Missionaries like Ansgar had laid the groundwork in the 9th century, but it was commerce that opened the real doors. A Christian merchant could navigate more ports, gain safer passage, and forge political alliances that a pagan raider never could. Some Viking leaders were practical about it. Conversion wasn't about belief, it was about business. Harald Bluetooth, the Danish king who ruled in the 10th century, famously embraced Christianity. But his runestones tell a story of balance, honoring old gods while promoting new ones. It wasn't surrender. It was adaptation. So by the late Viking Age, the Norse had become more than just seafarers and swordsmen. They were cultural chameleons, able to blend, adapt, and thrive. One of the best examples? The Byzantine Varangian Guard. We've mentioned them before: Vikings who served as elite warriors for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. But they weren't just bodyguards. They were diplomats, advisors, and sometimes even power brokers. Imagine that. A man born on a fjord, now shaping policy in the marble halls of an empire that traced its lineage to Rome. One such man was Harald Hardrada. Before he became king of Norway, Harald served in the Varangian Guard for nearly a decade. He fought in Syria, Sicily, and the Holy Land. He brought back not just wealth, but stories, strategies, and styles. When he returned north, he wasn't just a warrior. He was a man of the world. And in 1066, when he sailed to claim the English throne, he did so not as a raider, but as a cosmopolitan conqueror. He failed, of course killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but his death is often considered the end of the Viking Age, because by then, the world had changed. The Viking world wasn't gone, it had simply been absorbed. Their descendants ruled in England, Ireland, Normandy, and Russia. Their language left traces in English, Russian, and even Arabic. Their trade routes had redrawn the map of medieval Europe and Asia. And their legacy? It's not found in war alone. It's found in the threads of silk on a Swedish noble's cloak. In the Islamic silver buried in a Danish field. In the Byzantine graffiti carved into the walls of Hagia Sophia. It's found in connection, because long before passports and shipping lanes, the Vikings forged a global network using nothing but oars, sails, silver, and the will to explore. They weren't just adventurers of the seas, they were architects of exchange. And their story? It's still unfolding every time a silver coin is unearthed, every time a runestone is read anew, Every time, a city remembers that its roots began with the drip of water from a Norseman's paddle. The smell of tar and sweat lingers as the longship docks. The market is busy, full of clinking coins, clashing tongues, and the aroma of drying fish. But something else moves through this place. Something quieter, heavier. A presence no one announces, but everyone knows. You feel it in the glance between traders, in the way eyes shift when certain goods are exchanged. Not all wealth here is traded in silver or silk. Slavery. It is the ghost beneath Viking trade, silent, but ever present. Slaves, or thralls as they were called, were not rare outliers in Viking society. They were part of its foundation. Taken. During raids, born into bondage, or purchased from distant lands, these men, women, and even children became currency. Some were traded like livestock. Others became servants in longhouses, or muscle in the docks, or worse. Reminders that not every Viking journey was for glory. You've likely heard tales of brave warriors, storming monasteries or defending fjords. But far less is said about what happened to the monks they captured or the village children left behind. Many of them didn't die, they were taken. Loaded onto ships and sold at market. The largest Viking trade centers. Places like Hedeby, Rib, and Dublin weren't just bustling marketplaces for spices and furs. They were hubs of human trade. A longship might carry amber, walrus ivory, and 10 human lives chained below deck, and yet these markets had a strange duality. The same trader who negotiated for a slave might later buy fine linen for his wife, or exchange silver for honey mead. Deals were struck with laughter and handshakes, while a silent figure knelt behind the stall. Slavery wasn't hidden. It was normalized. Thralls could be seen everywhere, tending farms, rowing boats, building homes. They built the very cities that hosted the marketplaces. Many never saw freedom again, but here's where it gets murky. Some thralls eventually earned their freedom. A few, if skilled enough, rose to respected positions. There are records of freed thralls becoming craftsmen or even warriors. One saga tells of a freed man who became the foster father to a Viking chieftain's son. Historians still debate whether these stories were common or rare. Exceptions dressed up for moral comfort, and it wasn't just Norsemen who trafficked in slavery. Slavic tribes, Baltic groups, even Byzantine merchants all played their part. Slaves could be traded from the Arctic Circle to the edge of Baghdad. In fact, the very word slave is believed to derive from Slav, reflecting just how often Slavic people were captured and sold in Viking markets. One Byzantine envoy visiting the Rus, a Viking-descended people, wrote of slaves being traded by the boatload. Bound, silent, eyes vacant. That was the product. That was the price. In some eerie way, slavery made Viking trade more efficient. With a labor force that didn't demand wages, Norse traders could build faster, travel longer, profit more. Need someone to row your ship for 10 days straight? Get a thrall. Want a craftsman but can't afford one? Buy a skilled prisoner of war. The line between trade and raid began to blur. Some expeditions were launched not for land or treasure, but to capture new stock. A monastery in England or a Slavic village could represent hundreds of silver pieces in human lives. This wasn't a secret. Viking sagas didn't shy away from it. They just didn't dwell on it. There's a strange artifact found in Sweden, an iron collar engraved with the phrase, "I belong to Haken." It's believed to have been worn by a slave. The fact that it was engraved tells you something. Even in bondage, ownership was branded with pride. And yet, in some households, thralls were buried alongside their masters. Not always as equals, but as part of the legacy. In a twisted way, they became fixtures in death as in life. There are also tales, some almost too bizarre to believe, of thralls being sacrificed during funerals. In one particularly grim account, a female slave was said to be strangled and stabbed so that she could accompany her master into the afterlife. Historians still debate whether this was ritual practice or rare spectacle. The ethical questions echo into our time. Can a society be remembered for its daring exploration and intricate trade routes, while also embracing human bondage? The Vikings didn't see a contradiction. To them, a thrall was property, just as an axe or cloak or longship was. Morality wasn't part of the ledger. So next time you imagine a bustling Viking market crowded stalls, the shimmer of silver, the scent of salt air, look a little closer. Behind the barrels and beneath the tarps are lives uncounted, forgotten faces. Silent prophets. That's the other side of the Viking Golden Age, and even now it lingers. Like smoke after fire. A breeze catches the edge of a fabric draped over a wooden stall. It flutters smooth, vibrant, and strangely out of place amid the rough wool and coarse linen. It's silk, real silk. Not woven in Scandinavia, not even in Francia, but thousands of miles away, in China. How did this treasure end up here, in a cold, muddy Viking trading post? To trace that path, you'd need to follow it across steppelands, past Persian bazaars, along winding rivers, through the Kiev and Rus, and finally across the Baltic Sea in the belly of a longship. Silk was not just a luxury, it was proof. Proof. But the Vikings were more than raiders. They were connectors. Bridge builders between East and West. And silk wasn't the only wonder they carried home. By the time the 9th century rolled around, certain Viking merchants, particularly those who traveled eastward, began returning with goods that seemed almost mythical to their peers. Intricately patterned textiles. Swords forged with steel so pure and strong they made local blades seem like toys. Coins stamped with Arabic script. Even spices, unfamiliar and aromatic, carried in tiny leather pouches. This wasn't accidental. These weren't one-off finds from chance encounters. These were the results of systematic trade, long journeys, and precise negotiation. Take the Ulfberth sword, for example, a blade so advanced in its metallurgy, some believed it was forged with magic. Many of these swords, uncovered in Viking graves, bear inscriptions in Latin and contain steel with a carbon content unheard of in Europe at the time. Metallurgists today suggest the iron came from the East, likely from Persia or even India. Which raises the question, were Vikings just buyers? Or did they master the trade routes so completely that they became curators of global weaponry? In cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Gardarek, Norse traders, often referred to as the Rus, didn't just pass through, they settled. They built forts. They married local women. They created hybrid cultures. And from these outposts, Viking merchants gained direct access to the Silk Road's northern arteries. Arab travelers like Ibn Fadlan encountered them firsthand and left behind detailed, often shocked accounts. To the Islamic world, these Norsemen were giants, towering, tattooed, and dripping with wealth. Some of them worshipped gods like Odin. Others had converted to Christianity or Islam, depending on where their fortunes took them. But while they adapted languages and customs to make deals, they never forgot what truly mattered: silver. That shimmering currency, lighter than gold, beloved by Norsemen. Silver dirhams from Baghdad were so valued that they've been found in burial sites as far north as Iceland, and sometimes it wasn't the goods themselves, but the ideas that traveled with them. Viking jewelry began to mirror Eastern patterns. Their clothing absorbed hints of Persian fashion. Their burial customs became more elaborate, perhaps influenced by the grandeur of Eastern empires. Even their myths might have borrowed fragments from the travelers they met along the way. But silk remained the crown jewel. In Viking society, to own silk was to own status. It wasn't worn for warmth or practicality. It was worn to dazzle, to intimidate, to rise above. In one famous grave known today as the Oseberg ship, burial fragments of silk were found tucked among the remains of two noble women, imported, dyed, embroidered with Eastern motifs, and yet buried, never to be seen again. That act of burying silk rather than selling it tells you everything. For the Vikings, wealth was not just for spending. It was for showing, for legacy. But the relationship between Norse traders and the East wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes those long ships weren't filled with goods to trade, but men ready to raid. Constantinople, the gem of Byzantium, suffered Viking attacks more than once. And yet, paradoxically, those same Vikings were hired by Byzantine emperors as elite mercenaries, the famous Varangian Guard. Imagine that. One year they attacked the city. The next, they defend its gates. These contradictions made Viking trade uniquely opportunistic. They weren't loyal to kingdoms or borders. They were loyal to the deal, to silver, to the next exotic treasure they could carry back west and trade for 10 times the price. And while it's easy to romanticize this, the brave explorer, merchant bringing back silks and spices, there's a darker side too. Many of those eastern wonders were acquired through coercion, through exploitation, through deals made with warlords or at the edge of a blade. The truth? The Viking economy was built on a fusion of 3 things: risk, reputation, and reach. Risk, because every journey east could mean death. Reputation, because word of a merchant's honesty or brutality could travel faster than his ship. And reach, because the farther you went, the rarer your goods, the higher your status. In the end, silk didn't just symbolize luxury. It symbolized power. It was the proof that you had seen more, dared more, and that's what made you a legend, not just in Scandinavia, but across the entire known world. The clang of metal, the roar of battle, the creak of longships against the waves, these are the sounds that echo through most tales of the Viking Age. But listen more closely, and you might hear something softer, yet no less powerful. The rustle of linen skirts, the snap of a ledger closing, the sharp command of a woman overseeing her household, her farm, her trade. While Viking men sailed off in search of silver and conquest, it was the women who kept the world running back home. And in many cases, they did far more than just manage. They ruled, quietly, shrewdly, and with an economic cunning that shaped the fortunes of entire families. In Viking society, women, especially those of status, held surprising economic freedom for their time. They could own land. They could inherit wealth. They could initiate divorce. And most importantly, they could run businesses. Picture a typical Viking homestead while the men were away at sea. Livestock had to be cared for, crops harvested, goods crafted, and seasonal trade prepared. Who made these decisions? Who organized the trade caravans, negotiated prices with passing merchants, or oversaw the transport of goods to local markets? The answer: the husfreyja, the woman of the house. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was a manager, a matriarch, and often a merchant. In towns like Hidibi or Rib, archaeologists have uncovered wooden writing tablets and weighing scales in homes believed to belong to women. Runic inscriptions on jewelry and pottery suggest ownership or even signatures, likely marks of women who were literate enough to track transactions and assert their role in commerce. And Viking sagas, though embellished, offer glimpses into these powerful women. One tale tells of Odd the Deep-Minded, a widow who commanded her own fleet, traveled from Scotland to Iceland, and founded a settlement. She distributed land, negotiated alliances, and ensured her family's survival in a harsh new world. But women didn't just manage what was already there. They created wealth. They were central to the Viking textile industry, an often overlooked pillar of the Norse economy. From raising sheep and spinning wool to weaving and dyeing, Viking women produced textiles not just for household use but for export. In fact, cloth was so valuable that it often served as a form of currency. A well-woven bolt of woolen fabric could be traded for tools, livestock, or even slaves. And who controlled that production line? Women. Some high-status women even presided over trade networks that rivaled those of their male counterparts. They organized shipments, arranged dowries involving imported goods, and used their economic clout to forge alliances between families and clans. They wore their power too, not just in fine jewelry or imported silks, but in a small, symbolic object: the key. Keys, often hung from a woman's belt, weren't just practical tools. They were symbols of authority, of her control over the household's resources. A woman who wore many keys signaled that she had many responsibilities. Chests of food, cupboards of silver, doors to granaries and storerooms. And then there's the vulva, the Viking seeress. Though her power was spiritual rather than economic, she often commanded gifts, favors, and trade in exchange for prophecy. Her staff, often buried with her, was part wand, part scepter, a symbol of respect. In some communities, her influence could rival that of a chieftain. Of course, not all Viking women lived lives of comfort or control. Many were farm laborers, slaves, or wives with little say in their fates. But for those who did hold power, their influence often outlasted their husbands. In burials across Scandinavia, female graves have been found containing imported goods amber from the Baltics, beads from India, silver dirhams from Baghdad. These were not tokens gifted by others. These were tools of trade, symbols of status, perhaps even inventory from businesses they ran themselves. And while Viking men carved out legacies with axes and oaths, Viking women etched theirs in wool. Silver and stone dot, it's tempting to see Viking trade as a masculine affair. Long ships, harsh deals, sword-guarded cargo, but behind every ship's return was a woman counting the silver. Behind every trade fair was a loom. Behind every merchant family that rose to power was a matriarch who knew the value of every ounce of salt, every spool of thread, every whispered deal in the shadows of the market. They didn't need to shout. Their power was quiet, but it was everywhere. Trade was never just about tools, furs, or silver. Hidden among the barrels of ale and bolts of wool, another category of goods quietly changed hands items, not of survival, but of faith. And for the Vikings who sailed with Odin's ravens, carved into their ships, yet willingly traded with Christian monks, these spiritual objects were more than relics. They were currency, trophies, and tools of power. In the early centuries of Viking expansion, monasteries made tempting targets, not just because they held gold or livestock, but because they contained items unlike anything the Norse had seen before: jeweled crucifixes, Latin manuscripts written in inks that shimmered under firelight, carved ivory saints, and sacred vessels too fine to be crafted in the north. To the raiders, these were first spoils of war, but very quickly something more. Viking leaders began to realize that these holy objects, though meaningless to pagan beliefs, held extraordinary trade value. A golden chalice plundered from Lindisfarne might be melted down, or it might be passed along a trade route, growing in value as it traveled from hand to hand. Eventually, it might end up in the hoard of a Baltic chieftain, or even sold back to a Christian bishop willing to pay dearly for the return of a lost treasure. In this way, Viking raids unintentionally created a religious black market, a network in which Christian artifacts, pagan idols, sacred runestones, and ceremonial jewelry moved freely between cultures. Not as worship, but as commerce. And it wasn't one-sided. As Norse people settled in places like Ireland, England, and Normandy, they began to absorb elements of Christianity. Crosses began to appear alongside Thor's hammer on pendants. Churches were built next to long houses. By the 10th century, many Viking leaders had converted, not always out of faith, but out of diplomacy and economic opportunity. Conversion opened doors to alliances, land grants, and trade privileges within the Christian world, and it allowed Norse merchants to deal in items that were once forbidden or taboo. But even among those who stayed pagan, religion remained a source of profit. Viking artisans crafted miniature idols of Odin, Thor, and Freya, items that could be worn as amulets or traded as protective charms. These were cast in bronze or silver and sold in marketplaces from Scandinavia to Russia. Spiritual tourism, too, had its place. Some sacred sites in the Norse world, like the Great Temple at Uppsala, became destinations not just for worshippers, but for pilgrims and traders. During major festivals or seasonal rites, markets would spring up around temples where people bought sacrifices, idols, and charms. Even magic became marketable. The Volar, female seeresses skilled in prophecy and magic, often accepted gifts or payments in exchange for their visions. These might include food, silver rings, dyed cloth, or exotic items brought back from distant lands. Their staffs, often buried with them, were status symbols indicating that prophecy was a profession as much as a calling. In some settlements, traders carried small carved stones etched with runes, said to bring luck in deals or ward off deception. One such stone, found in Gotland, bears a message that roughly translates, "He who holds this shall trade wisely and be watched by the gods." Whether it worked or not, someone clearly believed in its value. Religious goods even intersected with burial traditions. Wealthy Vikings were often buried with objects meant to serve them in the afterlife: weapons, tools, food, but also religious tokens. Some graves contained Christian crosses alongside pagan symbols, suggesting either religious ambiguity or a clever hedge, better to be covered, no matter who was right about the afterlife. These graves also contained imported items, beads from the Middle East, miniature Buddhas from the Silk Road, and silver coins bearing the names of Muslim caliphs. None of these were part of Norse faith, but they were included, perhaps, as trophies of worldly success, or as proof that the deceased had touched faraway lands, gathered their power, and returned. What's clear is this: in the Viking world, faith and commerce were not separate. Whether worshipping Odin or attending Mass, people bought their way into favor through sacrifices, donations, and spiritual trinkets, and the merchants who understood this, who knew which charms to carry, which relics to offer, which temple markets to attend, profited handsomely. They weren't priests, but they dealt in belief. And belief, in any age, is a powerful thing to sell. In this swirling blend of pagan traditions and Christian influence, Viking markets became crossroads not just of cultures, but of cosmoses. A place where gold rings and holy water might change hands on the same table, where a merchant might swear by Thor, yet wear a cross, just in case, where gods could be bought, sold, stolen, or carried in one's pocket for luck on the next long voyage, because when you're far from home, crossing stormy seas, one never knows which god is listening. Before the printing press, before telegrams or radio waves, before the buzz of electricity ever danced through copper wire, there were Viking marketplaces. And in these crowded, noisy, chaotic places, news traveled faster than sails on the open sea. Merchants came not only with goods, but with gossip, rumors, and reports from distant lands. A blacksmith from Hedeby might learn of a new Christian king in Wessex. A fur trader from the Baltic might bring tales of Slavic uprisings. A Norse merchant returning from Constantinople might describe the splendor of the emperor's palace, the streets paved in marble, and the strange foods of the East. This was the Viking world's version of the evening news, but there was no anchor behind a desk. Instead, information passed from mouth to mouth, stall to stall, ship to ship. And the accuracy? Well, that depended on the storyteller. Marketplace talk served more than idle curiosity. It shaped decisions, influenced voyages, and shifted allegiances. A rumor about new coinage in Francia might spark a rush of traders seeking better silver. News of Christian missionary efforts could cause pagan leaders to crack down or convert. Whispers of a new warlord uniting clans in Norway might inspire merchants to reroute to avoid conscription or conflict. In a world where literacy was rare and scrolls more valuable than swords, people became the medium. A traveling merchant was as much a trader of ideas as of goods. And the more he traveled, the more valuable his knowledge became. Some traders took this role seriously. There are records of Norse envoys acting as diplomatic couriers, bringing not only goods but treaties, marriage proposals, and intelligence between kingdoms. Their ships became floating post offices, delivering missives across seas and rivers. Marketplaces themselves became centers of intelligence. Not only were goods exchanged here, but also languages. It wasn't uncommon to hear half a dozen tongues in a single stall: Old Norse, Latin, Arabic, Greek, Slavic, Gaelic. Traders learned to speak in multiple languages or used interpreter brokers, creating a unique form of multilingual communication that relied on gestures, repetition, and instinct. What's more, maps were born in these places, not the kind drawn with ink, but those built in the mind. A merchant might describe a river that led to a forest filled with beavers or a coastline that curved like a sickle. These descriptions passed along trade networks until slowly, a mental geography of the Viking world took shape. One trader's recollection of a mountain range in Asia might eventually inform a shipbuilder's decision to construct a vessel with a broader keel for rocky shores. A tale of shallow rivers could lead to the invention of flat-bottomed boats for inland navigation. The flow of ideas was as important as the flow of coin. Through these conversations, the Vikings picked up foreign customs, tactics, technologies, and religious concepts. From the Franks, they learned fort-building and siegecraft. From the Slavs, they adopted spiral broach and agricultural tools. From the Arabs, they gained insight into advanced metallurgy and mathematics, but the most powerful piece of information was not about tools or kings. It was about opportunity. A trader who heard that a distant village had no ironsmith might return weeks later with tools to sell. One who caught wind of a plague in a rival port could reroute before being trapped. Those who knew where grain had failed could sell food at a premium. Those who knew where it abounded could buy cheap. In this way, Viking merchants became early economic forecasters, reading not charts, but conversations, the laughter of buyers, the worry in a chieftain's eyes, the way a sailor hesitated before naming a port. Even local chieftains and kings relied on traders for updates. A wealthy merchant could have more knowledge of foreign powers than a warlord cloistered in his hall. That made traders powerful and sometimes dangerous. A whisper dropped in the right ear could lead to alliances or betrayals, trade embargoes or invasions. Of course, not all news was true. Lies were also currency. Some merchants exaggerated the dangers of rival markets to keep competitors away. Others spread fear of ghosts or sea monsters to guard a secret trade route. But even false news had power. If enough people believed a river was haunted, no ships would pass. If a rumor grew that silver was cursed in one region, its value would drop. In this way, Viking traders not only shared information, they also shaped reality. And so, the marketplace, crowded with shouting voices, clanging metal, and salty air, was much more than a place to buy and sell. It was a living, breathing network, a system of human nodes, bound not by wires, but by stories. Stories that crossed borders, stories that changed lives, stories that made the Viking world feel, for a moment, like one vast village, connected by waves, by words, and by the will to know what lay beyond the horizon. At the dawn of the Viking Age, the word Viking struck fear across the shores of Europe. Cloaked in furs, armed with axes, and backed by swift longships, these men came not to trade, but to take. Monasteries were looted, villages burned, and wealth stripped from the trembling hands of those unprepared for their fury. But not all Vikings remained raiders. In fact, by the middle of the 9th century, something curious began to happen. Some of these ruthless warriors began to settle and sell. Why? Because they realized that trade could be just as profitable as war, without the risk of a sword in the gut. Imagine this. A Viking chieftain sails to the Frankish coast, prepared for plunder. But instead of resistance, he finds a local lord, willing to offer silver for peace, and maybe even an exclusive trade deal. The chieftain returns home richer than if he'd fought, and with fewer scars. Word spreads. Other raiders begin to think, why fight when they'll pay us to stay? Thus began one of the most fascinating transformations in Viking history, the shift from pillager to entrepreneur. Some settled permanently near the places they once raided. They intermarried, formed alliances, and started towns. Dublin in Ireland, for instance, began as a Viking longfort, a raiding base, but grew into a bustling trade city under Norse control. The same pattern repeated across England, Scotland, the Baltics, even parts of France. Normandy, literally land of the Northmen, was granted to Viking leader Rollo in exchange for peace. His descendants would later shape European history, including one named William the Conqueror. These ex-raiders became lords, governors, and merchant princes. They built markets, taxed goods, and organized caravans. Their former longships, once instruments of terror, were repurposed into cargo vessels. The same boldness that once drove them to raid foreign lands now drove them to dominate international trade. But the change wasn't just strategic, it was cultural. Raiders lived for glory and battle. Merchants lived for profit and prestige. And that meant a new code of conduct, honesty in deals, reputation for fairness, knowledge of weights, measures, and foreign customs. Skills that would have once seemed beneath a warrior now became signs of a successful man. Weapons still played a role, of course. Viking traders often traveled armed, and merchant ships were well defended. But instead of seeking conflict, they avoided it. War was bad for business. Stability meant profit. And so, the same Norsemen who once toppled kings now brokered peace between rival tribes to ensure the safety of their roots. They brought home silks and spices from the east, coins from the Caliphate, glassware from Byzantium, and fine wool from the British Isles. These goods changed not only the Viking economy, but Viking identity. Homes became richer, clothing more elaborate, feasting halls more ornate. The Norse world, once rugged and raw, began to show signs of luxury. Some of these merchants grew incredibly wealthy enough to rival kings. And while sagas still sang of warriors, the new generation began to admire a different kind of legend, the man who could outbid a rival, not outfight him. One tale speaks of Otter, a Viking merchant who sailed north past the White Sea and south to the Frankish ports, recording detailed descriptions of his voyages for King Alfred of Wessex. He wasn't famous for battles, but for the distances he traveled and the goods he brought back. In a few short generations, the image of the Viking had shifted dramatically from blood-soaked raider to fur-robed merchant with a scroll in one hand and a coin in the other. Yet, not everyone embraced the change. There were those who saw this new merchant class as soft, unworthy of the gods of war. They mocked the traders who bartered instead of bled. In some sagas, merchants are described as sly and effeminate, clever, but not heroic. But time proved otherwise. By the 10th century, trade had become the backbone of Viking influence. Merchant ports like Hedeby, Birka, and Koppang grew into economic powerhouses. Their wealth financed expeditions, supported local rulers, and attracted skilled artisans. Even old warrior clans came to depend on trade for their wealth. Ironically, the very success of Viking commerce helped bring an end to the era of raids. As borders stabilized and kingdoms grew stronger, raiding became riskier and less profitable. But trading? That could go on forever, as long as there were ships to sail and goods to exchange. And so, the final transformation of the Viking world wasn't written in blood, but in ledgers, treaties, and trade routes. The axe gave way to the scale. The battle cry was replaced by negotiation. The world came to know the Norse not only as warriors, but as masters of the marketplace. From terror to trade, they had reshaped their destiny and changed the course of history in the process. For a time, it seemed the Norse world had found a golden balance, ships flowing in and out of busy ports, marketplaces thriving with exotic goods, alliances growing between far-flung rulers and Viking chieftains. Hedeby sparkled as the crown jewel of commerce. Birka hummed with prosperity, and the once savage sons of Odin had transformed into shrewd negotiators and noble traders. But history, as always, moves in cycles. And every empire, no matter how rich, bold, or cunning, eventually reaches a turning point. The fall of Viking trade dominance didn't come from a single blow. It wasn't the result of one war, or one bad harvest, or even one betrayal. It came from a series of subtle shifts, each small on its own, but together enough to crack the mighty Norse trading machine. First, there was competition. By the late 10th century, the kingdoms of Europe, once fractured and helpless, had begun to unite. Stronger governments meant better law enforcement, safer roads, and more regulated markets. Local traders no longer needed Viking merchants to supply their goods. Frankish, Saxon, and Slavic traders began building their own networks, pushing the Norse to the fringes of the economy they once dominated. Second came Christianization. As Viking leaders converted, some by choice, others by sword. The very culture of the Norse changed. Pagan rituals that had once united merchant clans were now seen as heretical. Old gods like Odin and Freya faded into legend. Monasteries once looted for treasure were now protected, sometimes even supported by Viking rulers who had become Christian kings. This wasn't just a religious shift, it was a political one. Viking territories became feudalized, drawn into the same power struggles that plagued medieval Europe. Trade routes that had once been free and Norse-controlled were now taxed, restricted, or absorbed into larger kingdoms. Independence vanished, along with the autonomy that had allowed Viking traders to thrive. Then there was violence. Not the violence of Vikings raiding others, but others now striking back. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings, launched an invasion of England. His defeat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the symbolic end of the Viking Age. Just weeks later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Norse settlers in Normandy, would claim England. The world had changed. The Vikings were no longer feared invaders, but players in the game of kings and often pawns. Trade cities suffered. Hidibi, once the heart of northern commerce, was attacked and burned in the mid-11th century. Its decline was swift and irreversible. Birka vanished from records. Kopang withered into obscurity. Centers of wealth became ghost towns. The great Viking merchant families, once able to outfit fleets with a word, lost influence. Their ports, once vital, were bypassed for newer, better connected cities deeper in Europe. New trade powers emerged. The Hanseatic League, an alliance of northern European merchant guilds, began to dominate Baltic trade. These German-led cities were better organized, better defended, and backed by powerful states. Viking merchants could no longer compete. The longships gave way to cogs and hulks. Norse control of the seas slipped into history. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't political, religious, or economic. It was cultural. The children of Viking traders no longer saw themselves as Norse. They spoke the tongues of the lands they settled in Old English, Norman French, Russian. They followed the laws of their kings, not the customs of their ancestors. They married locals, adopted new dress, and raised their children to be farmers, priests, or knights, not raiders or merchants. And yet, echoes remained. In Iceland, the sagas kept the stories alive. In York, artifacts of trade scales, coins, brooches were buried beneath centuries of earth, waiting to be rediscovered. In Russia, the name Rus endured, giving its name to the very land Russia that Viking traders had once helped shape. The legacy of the Viking trade empire wasn't lost. It was absorbed. It became part of the foundations of modern Europe. Their innovations in shipbuilding influenced centuries of naval design. Their networks of trade helped knit together East and West, and their bold spirit, the willingness to venture into the unknown, remained in the blood of the lands they touched. It's tempting to see the end of the Viking trade empire as a fall, collapse from glory. But in truth, it was a transformation. The Vikings didn't disappear. They evolved. The merchants became nobles. The traders became founders. The raiders became rulers. And their greatest conquest was time itself. Because today, over 1,000 years later, their influence still ripples through the world, hidden in place names, customs, languages, and legends. They were more than warriors, more than merchants. They were the bridge between the ancient and the medieval, between the wild and the civilized, between the sea and the land. Their story doesn't end, it simply changes course, just like the rivers they once sailed.